Final Fantasy VIII is a game that's had its share of criticism over the years, with one of the more vocal critiques surrounding its stoic, removed protagonist of Squall Leonhart. Yet it is often forgotten that Final Fantasy VIII is a tale of two stories, a tale of two characters. The inclusion of Laguna Loire was not simply a case of furnishing players with a backstory at periodic intervals, but a conscious narrative decision to affect the mood and pace of the overall game. So how does Laguna's inclusion impact Final Fantasy VIII? What does this character and sub-story do besides subtly hint at past events? And why could we go so far as to say that Laguna Loire salvages Final Fantasy VIII? Jumping right in, a factor that is admittedly somewhat subjective, but I do assume would have allured in some other players too, is the initial curveball of Laguna's introduction and the strange collective dreams our party members are having on the train to Timber. I've long discussed how this spurred me on to play the game and uncover the mystery, and it was perhaps for others too an intriguing hook to keep us playing the game until its revelation about midway through after speaking with Alone. So from a plot and pacing perspective, veering into the Laguna story at the point in time we did, thinking we were embarking on some other mission and then being thrown into a completely abstract scenario, playing as Galbadian soldiers, who, to this point, we presumed are our enemies, it was a great way to break up the otherwise linear trajectory of Final Fantasy VIII's opening stanza and contrasts the game with, for example, Final Fantasy VII, which had the lengthy journey through Midgar at the beginning of the game with no reprieve, and other games like Final Fantasy VI pretty much had a relentless flight away from the Empire in the opening few hours. Beyond narrative pacing, and perhaps more importantly, the introduction of Laguna and his party served to juxtapose the primary story in several ways that worked in the game's favour, I think. Indeed, Final Fantasy VIII has often been criticised for the lack of variety in its party members, as, with the exception of Rinoa, each of them are students from the Seed Academies, and each of them originate from the same place at Adir's orphanage, which is a far cry from the motley ensembles that comprise basically every previous Final Fantasy game. It's often overlooked that the Laguna team does offer some degree of variety in the playable cast, albeit in a smaller, scenario-specific way. They take us away from the machinations of the Garden Academies and their respective missions and into the workings of the Galbadian military, or rather, a hapless microcosm of this particular unit within the Galbadian machine. Taking a step closer, the real juxtaposition between these two stories comes in the character of Laguna himself. He is, from the moment we meet him, an affable, unserious, and somewhat inept goofball of a character. He is a terrible soldier, but irrefutably good-natured. He has an obvious openness and closeness to his two comrades Kiros and Ward, and leans on their support, listens to their opinions, and enjoys banter and recreational time with them. Laguna's character is then the complete opposite of our main protagonist Squall Leonhart, who is a competent, methodical, and serious to a fault mercenary, but one who consciously closes himself off from the world and from other people. Indeed, the only prolonged conversations that Squall tends to have are with himself in the form of internal monologues, and his interactions with other people through at least half of the game are purely transactional, and frustrated by the consistent efforts of Zell, Quistis, and particularly Rinoa, who try to prise him out of this reserved emotional and removed state. And it's perhaps notable that the only real conversation or glimmer of opening up he has early in the game is with Cypher during the Dollet mission about whether or not they should break the rules, test their strength, which is a testament, I think, to Cypher being this sort of extension of self or shadow self for Squall, who he relates to on some level, even though he'd be loath to admit it. So the point here is that Squall's disinterested, standoffish demeanour through at least half the game would reasonably be frustrating for some players. And even looking back to Final Fantasy VII, where Cloud Strife has a not dissimilar demeanour of this professional disinterest when he's doing the Avalanche missions, he does at least have some moments of humour and importantly this amicable warmth in his shared childhood with Tifa, the meet cute with Aerith, and of course his own peculiar mystery going on with the periodic high-pitched flashbacks he gets in reference to this murky past. Squall doesn't have these heartwarming reprieves, and indeed, despite the excellent Waltz for the Moon dance sequence with Rinoa, his dynamic with her is largely Rinoa trying to coax him out of being antisocial right up to the end of Disc 2 when she falls into a coma. And this is where Laguna's story, and Laguna specifically, really swoops in and salvages what might for some players have become quite a frustrating or tedious experience of traversing the story entirely from Squall's perspective, whose personality is appealing to some but certainly not to all. And especially not for an entire game. So what these two protagonists do is offset one another and serve as tonal and characteristic reprieves from one another's attitudes, personalities and stories. Indeed, the question of whether either Squall or Laguna could carry an entire game on their own is a debatable one, but they certainly serve to combine and elevate one another through their juxtaposing worldview in this story that they share, which once again is emphasised by the structure and pace of Laguna's intervals and inclusions, which almost always come at dramatic, inopportune moments when we're expecting to be somewhere else or doing something else. The Timber Mission, the journey to Galbadia, and of course Squall being icicled by a deer are all moments that precede the flashback to Laguna's journey. So it really keeps us on our toes about what comes next, and indeed perhaps even for those that don't necessarily warm to Squall, keep us wondering about what condition he's in, particularly after moments like the Sorceress battle, while we are jaunting about Winhill with Laguna and the child alone. Ultimately, Laguna and Squall are purposeful opposites and juxtapositions of one another's character, helping establish one another by the extremities of their respective demeanours, but they also serve as reprieves for the player who might otherwise get fatigued by the perpetual stoicness or the hapless goofiness of one or the other. And as the game progresses and the Laguna dreams keep happening, this anticipation subtly builds towards the reconciliation of these two stories and characters. And by Disc 3, there was for many probably a desire to see these two polarised personalities finally appear on screen together. So these are the subtle ways in which the inclusion of Laguna saved and indeed elevated the calibre of Final Fantasy VIII's story, making it to this day one of the most unique entries of the Final Fantasy series. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon, or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.